Good evening and welcome. This is The Chase. I'm Andy Hodges. Reports indicate that there are over 3,500 NGOs working in Zimbabwe. Estimates indicate that there are over 200,000 NGOs in South Africa alone, up from 140,000 in 2015. There are an estimated 10 million non-governmental organizations or NGOs worldwide. In fact, some say that the NGO sector is one of the major growth areas within Africa. NGOs across the continent cover a wide range of areas, amongst which are humanitarian aid, education and training, women and gender, health, children and youth, poverty alleviation, issues concerning people with disabilities, and some would say the most contentious of them all, good governance, human rights, and democracy. Governments throughout Africa, however, perceive the work of some NGOs as regime change agents, working to the tune of their foreign donors and funders. NGOs in turn state that they are only bridging the gap and taking up responsibilities of fulfilling moral and social needs that ought to be taken up by governments that are unable to do so. Are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections? Join me and my guest tonight live on The Chase. Welcome back. This is The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion this evening, are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections? This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN. Now, to our millions of viewers joining online throughout Africa, Europe, America, the Middle East, and Asia, we would like to hear from you. So please join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network. So as usual, make sure we hear your voice. Now, joining us this evening on The Chase to discuss are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections are Professor Paul Mavima. He is Zimbabwe's Minister of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare. Bafo Ankoma, former editor of the London-based New African magazine and editor of the African Fact Book. Dr. Musa Kika, Executive Director, Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum. And joining us virtually, we welcome Dr. Neo Simutanyi, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, based in Lusaka, Zambia. Gentlemen, welcome to The Chase.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now, as usual, to my guests, you are all free to interject. However, remember, here at ZTN, our values are dignity, dialogue, and debate. And of course, all views expressed on The Chase are those of our guests and do not reflect the views of Zimbabwe Newspapers 1980 Limited or ZTN. Minister, I'd like to start with you. What does international law, regional law, for example, the African Charter on Democracy, provide for in terms of what and how NGOs can perform their functions in Africa as well as domestically within Zimbabwe?
Andy, the general expectation really is that the non-profit sector or the NGO sector is a sector that should complement what government does. It provides for issues of advocacy. It provides for issues of relief. It provides for issues of capacity building and empowerment of communities. But it comes in to do a complementary role. Internationally, what is now understood is that there is a kind of a triumvirate whereby government plays the larger regulatory role, provides a policy framework, and then there is the market, which is basically occupied by the private sector, but there's also a non-profit sector that does the things that I have indicated. It's never meant to occupy space that governments traditionally occupy, but it's supposed to undertake a complementary role to government.
Right. Minister, Zimbabwe's President Emerson Mnangagwa was quoted as saying earlier this year that, and I quote this, as the election season unfolds, we are observing a notable number of NGOs diverting from their operational mandates to delve into political matters that amounts to interference in the internal affairs of our sovereign country, that's Zimbabwe, of course. Your comment, do you believe that NGOs are the invisible hand in African elections? Does the Zimbabwean government have specific evidence that some NGOs, as stated by Zimbabwe's president and, of course, its government, are so-called regime change agents?
There is, to a very large extent, indications, Andy, that funds start flowing into the NGO sector, especially some minutes before elections. In this particular case, looking at 2023 in Zimbabwe, we begin to see NGOs that had become almost dormant beginning to receive some support, international support, for their activities. And really, in some cases, even the names themselves betray an agenda that tends to be nefarious. So indeed, there is that element. Those who are coming from outside will probably say, we are justified because we are promoting democracy. But there is nothing that justifies external funding of internal political processes. Internationally, that's a no-no. The Americans, for example, they are very strong on issues like that. But I want to tell you, Andy, that indeed we have information to the effect that some international organizations, not of the UN type, but internationally based organizations providing funding for NGOs that are operating in the country. And also some nations doing the same, providing funding for NGOs that operate.
So you have intelligence and evidence that this is happening as the government.
Exactly.
I'd now like to bring in Dr. Ngo-S. He's Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, based in Lusaka, Zambia. Ngo, again, welcome tonight to The Chase. Ngo,
good evening.
Good evening, sir. Ngo, you've heard the views expressed there by Zimbabwe's Minister of Labour, Social Welfare, of course. And another example I want to give you about NGOs is in Uganda, where the government froze the democratic governance facility of $100 million funding for NGOs, and they also suspended for 5 weeks before the presidential election that funding. But also the government further froze bank accounts of civil society organizations suspected to be friendlier to opposition parties. So, Ngo, in your view, in Africa, do NGOs have a positive influence and play a vital role? Are some of them a hindrance, working to push foreign agendas? Do you believe, as I asked the minister, that NGOs are the invisible hand in African elections?
And NGOs are extremely important. And as we have seen in Africa since the return of democracy, is that NGOs have played a very important role in enhancing civil liberty, especially educating the masses of their rights. Now, this role of NGOs, especially in the governance and human rights sector, it goes contrary to governments that are authoritarian, because the authoritarian repressive regimes don't want citizens to be free, don't want citizens to be independent, they want citizens to be able to express themselves and make demands on the state. And it's that empowering. And I heard the minister talking about the fact that NGOs are supposed to play empowering citizens. That role of empowering citizens is what governments don't want. Most governments in Africa don't want citizens to actually exercise their rights. And when the minister talks about that, there should be no external support or external financial support to NGOs, where are these NGOs supposed to raise their money? Where are they supposed to? How are they supposed to fund their operations? Because the state doesn't fund NGOs at all, and they have to scrounge to find resources to actually carry out their work. This is why NGOs tend to be externally funded, not because they want to, but that is the only way they can play that role.
Neil, let me just jump in there. Now, the minister did also say something which I'd like your comment on. He said that they've noticed the Zimbabwean government, NGOs that have been dormant for the last 4 years or so, and suddenly, just before elections, they suddenly get a whole raft of funding for them to start participating in terms of NGOs in the election process. What do you say to that comment?
The dormancy of NGOs, that they don't have resources, that's one. But they're also dormant when they are repressed. It's true that, in some countries, NGOs that go underground because they're repressed. Their leaders are arrested. People cannot be allowed to protest and so forth. And that gives the impression that they're dormant. But the thing is, democracy requires money. Democracy requires resources. So where you see, like in Uganda, that the state moving in to freeze accounts of NGOs, it is to repress them, is to make them unable to reach the masses, is to make them unable to mobilize, because the mobilization of the masses is a threat to those that hold power. So you find that the government passes laws that actually are repressive, because they make it difficult for these NGOs to be able to empower citizens, to educate them on their rights, to be able for them to exercise those things that they're supposed to do, like voting, and making a choice.
Neil, let me jump in there.
So really, I have a different view from the minister.
All right, let me jump in there. Before I move on to my other guest, Minister, I want to ask you directly then. You heard what Dr. Neo there from Zambia said. Does the Zimbabwean government consider NGOs a threat? Are you scared of NGOs as the government and believe that they would actually effectively change what's happening in the country?
Remember, Andy, I said we have a triumvirate of organizations that serve any nation, any population. We are not scared of NGOs. We work with NGOs, bona fide ones, who declare clearly what their mandate is, and who find adequate space for them to undertake their mandate. But we are wary of NGOs who receive foreign funding in order to influence the political climate in Zimbabwe, in order to influence the direction in which an election can take. No country in the world allows that to happen. But even those that consider themselves to be democratic. I refer to America. International funding, foreign funding for American elections is no. It doesn't happen. And no country that is worth its salt will allow that to happen. He refers, for example, to where NGOs can generate their resources. The non-profit sector can appeal to the public to internally to raise resources. That's what happens everywhere.
All right, let me thank you, Minister. Let me bring in my other guest. Before, look, there's no doubt, and even I think African governments acknowledge and commend that some NGOs can, should, and are playing a vital role in bridging the gap that African governments are unable to fill, especially in education, social, humanitarian, women and gender, health, children and youth, poverty alleviation, and issues, of course, concerning people with disabilities, amongst others. I think there's no doubt about that. It, however, appears that some African governments are publicly viewing the work of some NGOs as pushing the agenda of their funders and directly or indirectly attempting to bring about regime change in Africa, or at the very least, impose their views on the African continent. Now, you've had an opportunity to monitor elections in various African states. What has been your perception and experience with regards to NGOs' activities in elections, as well as, of course, as the Minister has alluded to, their financing?
Yeah, I think the key word there, which is missing in the general question you're asking, are NGOs the invisible hand? I think the key word there is some. Some NGOs, the invisible hand here. Some NGOs do marvelous work. We have to acknowledge it from the start. They do well. Some of them are used as fronts by Western governments to, because they are fronts, they use them to do work that the Western governments could not do from the front door. Yeah. I will cite you an example. Many years ago, at New African, when I was editor, we did a big cover story, about 25, 30 pages on NGO activities in Africa. And from our research, we found that in the past, while Western governments, if they want some information, they will send their spies, base them in embassies, so they go in. Now, they don't do that again. They will found the big international NGOs. I don't want to mention names. They found them, they give them the money, the big international NGOs, then farm out the job to this African NGO. That's why we have 140,000 NGOs to do what? Yeah. So they farm the jobs to them. And these African NGOs are the ones who are doing the legwork in their own countries. So they become the ones the Western governments, in effect, are using for, say, in Zimbabwe, we saw the regime change agenda, and how many NGOs were subsumed into it. So yes, I support the minister. Some NGOs must be regulated. They shouldn't be allowed to be doing the kind of things they are doing. And he said the USA, you couldn't do that. We were here when President Trump was railing against so-called Russian intervention in American elections. But that's exactly what America has been doing all over the place in Africa.
Musa, I think I wanted to bring you in now after you'd heard my other guests. You have a lot to unpack and respond to, I think. Let's start with your views on if it's true that NGOs in Zimbabwe have been used as conduits for illicit funding. Well, let's say some NGOs in Zimbabwe have been used as conduits for illicit funding meant to destabilize the country through funding biased activities, campaigns and vote buying, particularly for the opposition or the opposition not in power, let me put it that way. And I quote again the president of Zimbabwe saying, NGOs diverting from their operational mandates to delve into political matters that amounts to interference in the internal affairs of our sovereign country. Your comment.
We haven't seen any form of evidence presented to the nation or CSOs to say this group of CSOs has been funded to undertake political activity or money laundering or or terrorism activities, etc. We haven't seen that kind of evidence. But generally what you see world over, particularly in regimes that are authoritarian to semi-authoritarian, is they label any form of democracy, governance, human rights, accountability, anti-impunity work to be political activity. And that's for a reason, because it then justifies coming in to closely regulate. But when you are doing humanitarian work, when you are providing food and clothing and school fees, there is no problem. But once you start asking questions about how is the state using this money, or why is the state violently crushing protests in the streets, for instance, or why is there no accountability in such an area, it then becomes a problem. Granted, you would find rogue elements within the CSO space, just like within the political space you would find rogue elements. Just like within the business sector you would find rogue elements. But those, if they are doing illegal activity, if the evidence is there, they ought to be rooted out, they ought to be dealt with in accordance with the law.
But what about your views, though? I mean, you've heard both Bafo and the minister state that in other countries around the world, which is a fact, they do not allow foreign funding, particularly when it comes to election, lobbying, and so forth. I mean, America is a good example, and I think the UK as well does exactly the same thing. What would be your comment to that? Do you think that foreign funding for NGOs or some NGOs to participate in this sort of election activities or human rights activities should be allowed in a country like Zimbabwe or not?
What ought to be precluded is funding NGOs to directly participate in terms of supporting a candidate, supporting a party, or influencing the actual outcome of an election. What you can't do away with is political rights in terms of voter education, in terms of pushing for voter registration, pushing for women and youth to be better represented. Those kind of activities are part of the rights of citizens.
Granted, but elections, the funding for NGOs that participate in these sort of things you mentioned, NGOs supporting candidates and so forth, you believe that's a no-no?
Supporting candidates, definitely no, but not when it comes to activities that support political rights. Voter education, for instance, pushing for certain minority groups to be better represented, or even to participate in the political arena. In terms of our own constitution, that's a right, Section 86, Section 67. You find that in many international instruments, including regional instruments as well. You can't stop. Unfortunately, the reality in Zimbabwe, Andy, is that most civil society organizations are foreign funded. The reason being, our own government does not fund CSOs. Business in Zimbabwe does not fund CSOs. The state of the economy does not allow the citizen to part with the dollar to give an NGO.
So, so your view, NGOs, do you think they can be summed up, or some NGOs, as Bafor said, can be summed up as the invisible hand in African elections? Do you agree with that statement or not, to some degree?
Well, when we say invisible, it sort of presupposes or assumes a nefarious activity. Much of the work that NGOs do is visible. When you push for voter registration or for, voter participation, that's visible. But as I said, you will always find rogue elements in any form of space, and those should be identified. If the evidence is there, it must be put on the table.
I mean, we've been doing a lot of research, obviously, on this subject, and I think maybe the minister, before I move on, it's interesting in that one of the comments we saw was that these type of NGOs, or the NGOs that you may be talking about, are doing things openly, but there is a nefarious agenda behind them.
In actual fact, yes, they may appear as if they are impartially pushing for human rights, pushing for things like voter registration, sort of benign activities within the political space. But in actual fact, behind that facade, there is work that goes towards saying incumbent governments are authoritarian and anti-human rights, and therefore you need to move towards suggestively saying, go and work with the opposition, put the opposition into power, so that you can promote democracy. That happens.
That happens. Later in the show, we will talk about the linkage between the work of NGOs and who funds them. You're watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. This broadcast, of course, is coming to you live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion this evening: are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections? This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN. Remember, we'd like to hear from you, so please join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV network. So please make sure we hear your voice. Minister, in this segment, I want to look at something which I believe is causing some controversy within Zimbabwe, and that, of course, is Zimbabwe in the process of amending the Private Voluntary, or what they call the Private Voluntary Amendment Act. The amendment will, if passed, legalize such issues as barring any PVO from supporting or opposing any political party or any candidate in a presidential, parliamentary, or local government election, and further bars PVOs from political lobbying. And of course, there are other aspects of the amendment. Briefly, Minister, in your view, what is the actual purpose of the PVO amendment? Because I keep hearing, particularly from Dr. Neo in Zambia, this concept of afraid of NGOs. What is behind the PVO?
We cannot operate, Andy, in a political system without frameworks under which different institutions operate. We are, for example, in the process of deregistering 400 NGOs right now. We have been not active. They have not been compliant with even the existing law. They don't hold any annual general meetings. Their financials are not audited. So there has to be a framework. And this framework for the operations of PVOs has to always be reviewed. It's almost like second loop learning of whether our system is operating properly. And this is what we have done with this new bill that has now passed cabinet, is due to be gazetted and brought to parliament. We need to have a framework, a clear framework for the ways in which NGOs, PVOs can operate in this country. That's the purpose.
Okay, Kika, I want to bring you in. As Executive Director of Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, what is your view on the Private Voluntary Amendment Bill vis-a-vis the continuing operations of NGOs within Zimbabwe?
We have several concerns. Definitely there ought to be a framework. I think we can't debate that. But the content and the nature and the substance of that framework may become contentious. There is a bill that has been gazetted. It was gazetted on 5 November. Our major concern was that there weren't wide consultations, if there were any, regarding how best we can approach the regulation of CSO in Zimbabwe. Our view remains that we should move more towards self-regulation and open society as opposed to closing the space. The act that we have is a 1967 act. Yes, it has to be revised, but revised towards opening up civic space as opposed to closing civic space. There are factors that push us to regulate, but as I say, the nature of the regulation is what worries us. When you, for instance, are seeking to subject CSOs to more stringent registration mechanisms, more stringent operation mechanisms, allowing for interference by state actors in the internal governance of NGOs for reasons that are broad and subject to interpretation in whatever manner the regulator would want to interpret. So you would find some very vague and worrying provisions in that bill that may actually be used to restrict what CSOs do.
If I play the devil advocate for just a second, I mean, you talked about self-regulation. So I would assume the question would be, why have you not self-regulated up to now? Why only talk about self-regulation now that there's possibly an amendment bill coming up?
That is an issue that has been talked about for a while. What I would admit is that has not been elevated to the status of a national discussion. That has been coming up now because of the moves by the government to push for regulation, but that is something that actually was raised for as far back as 2004, when the NGO bill of 2004 was then gazetted. It wasn't then signed by the then President Robert Mugabe after several engagements. But this is an issue that has been on the table for now, and hopefully as we engage with the government over this bill, that is going to be a topic that will be discussed upon.
So you still believe that there's possibility of engagement with the government in terms of looking at it? I mean, it's already gone through cabinet. It's going to be gazetted and go to parliament. There's not a lot of space for you to make your views be heard, I believe.
No, Andy, the space is there.
Okay.
One thing you will realize, Andy, with any government policy, at the point of either cabinet approval or even the passing of a law by Parliament, you always have complaints of not sufficient consultation. And this is very convenient for organizations, especially organizations that take a more cynical perspective of the processes that government uses in order to reach out to citizens to make inputs into policies and into bills.
So you're saying there is still room for consultation?
There is. When this bill goes to Parliament, Parliament will do outreach sessions everywhere in the country. The portfolio committee responsible for social welfare will go out and meet with whoever wants to make contributions. During the process of debate in Parliament, any organization or individual can reach out to members of Parliament in order to present their views on these issues.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Neo, I know you've been waiting patiently. Let me come to you. I hope that you have or you have heard of the Private Voluntary Amendment Bill that Zimbabwe, as the Minister said, has gone to Cabinet, is going to be gazetted and eventually go to Parliament of Zimbabwe. So maybe you could comment on that bill if you have cited it. But furthermore, I want to talk about laws that limit NGO activity, such as receiving funds from foreign agencies, particularly to work on elections in different African countries. Your views?
Yes, I think what is happening in Zimbabwe is not in many other countries, a move to regulate, strictly regulate NGOs, especially those NGOs that are engaged in governance, democracy, and human rights issues, This is not.
So, Neil, we seem to be having a little bit of communication problems with you.
Okay.
I think we'll try and contact you in another way, because I think there's obviously network issues. Can you hear me? All right, okay, we'll try and contact Neil there, because he did have some pertinent points. Before, I'm not sure, again, if you've seen Zimbabwe's PPO amendment, which was, I think, as Musa said, on the 5th of November, it was put through and looked at by the cabinet. But do you believe that NGOs can be regulated effectively in Africa to meet the concerns of African governments as it relates to them engaging in what some governments perceive as political interference?
Yes, of course. Once they are based in Africa, they have to live by our laws. NGOs are not above the law. So African governments should find ways to regulate them. You see, sometimes Africa, we are too liberal. We are more liberal than the so-called liberal countries. Again, let me cite you one example. Many years ago, we did a cover story on the media in Britain. And we found that in Britain, there were more than 30 pieces of legislation that impinged on press freedom. But the guy at the BBC will come here in Harare and tell you that they are the freest in the world. But they had to maneuver through this maze of 30 pieces of legislation. One went to 17-something that says that if you advocated for the downfall of the monarchy, you had to be deported for the rest of your natural life. So the Guardian, at the time, wanted to do things like that. The Guardian couldn't do, they had to wait until the European Parliament human rights law came into view that superseded the British law before the Guardian started it. In Africa, we leave things like my brother here is talking about self-regulation, which is equivalent to doing nothing. Okay. So the governments must regulate. They should make it clear. You can move 1, 2, 3, 4 steps. You can move 5, 6, 7, so that the NGOs will know what they can do and what they cannot do. They must be regulated.
Okay. We actually managed to get back Dr. Neo Simutani, of course, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue, based in Lusaka, Zambia. Neo, we managed to get you back. Please, maybe you can continue. I can repeat the question if you like.
Yes, I will continue without the video now. Because, I think that's what the reason why there was the disturbance.
Please
can you hear me now?
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
Yes, I don't agree with Bafu. You see,
okay. Hello, Dr. Neo.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes,
we
can.
Hear me?
Yeah, we can. Please go ahead. We do have network problems, I believe. Please go ahead.
Yes, I'm saying the issue of regulation in itself is problematic. Because governments use it to suppress NGOs' work. That's why it's important to actually move in the direction of self-regulation. To talk about, you give the example of the UK, that the UK has all these things. But the thing is that we're not comparable, because the UK or the developed democracies allow space for NGOs or civil organizations to actually operate. They do that. They allow them. There's enough space for protests, demonstration, all these things. These are allowed. They are regulated, of course, but they're allowed. But our governments don't want that. They don't want even protests. When people protest against the government, that we demand that the government is accountable and so forth, they're shut down. So it's how these laws are used to justify repression, to justify, making it difficult for citizens to participate in the political process. This is the reason why these laws, like the proposed law in Zimbabwe, and in Zambia we have the NGO Act. There are many such legislation in most African countries. They are there to actually make it difficult for NGOs to do their work, because NGOs can be effective, and they have been effective. Even where they've been replaced, they've been able to organize. In Zambia, we had the NGOs that were not really they're very free. But they were able to rise up to the occasion, especially during the last elections, to mobilize people, to educate them of their rights and their rights to express themselves and to go to the polls, to turn up in large numbers. And this has happened. You know, even in areas where there's repression, NGOs have actually managed to reach people using other strategies. But the thing is that for governments, they find them to be against them. They find them to be competitors. That actually, by empowering the people, they are campaigning for the opposition. And that's not the reason. That they just to empower people, to make them realize that the power to change governments is in the people. It's not in the NGOs, it's in the people themselves. So I think that is really important. But that is what the governments don't want. Most governments feel NGOs are competitors for power, and they feel that they are much more aligned. But I think one point which I want to correct from what Bafu said earlier on is that there are NGOs which are sponsored by the state, which are there to, the rogue ones, which actually are there to justify even the wrong thing the government is doing. We have so many of those in Zambia, hired NGOs, hired individuals who are there to give a bad name to NGOs, so that they actually, whenever a legitimate NGO organization says something, then they counter that by legitimizing it and making it look like that person is hired by the West and so forth. I think this idea of thinking that making demands on what we want as Africans is because we are sponsored by Africa. I think that is wrong. Okay. We have had this democracy for 30 years, but we are still being told that for us to make demands that we need constitutional reform, for us to make demands that we need the rights, we are being told to do that by the West. That is wrong. We have a legitimate right to make these demands. It's not because we're sponsored to do that.
Okay, let me jump in there. Thank you. You're watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. Our discussion this evening, are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections? This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN. Remember, as always, we would like to hear from you. So please join this discussion on our Twitter handle at ZTN News and on our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network. So make sure we hear your voice. Minister, I was going to ask you this later on in the show, but I think I'll ask you now. Critics state that it is only when an African government is criticized, questions asked, or literature produced that points out the government's perceived failings or shortcomings that such players as NGOs are then called regime change agents and against the government in question. Your comment?
It is never like that, and it should never be like that. The responsibility to hold governments accountable is and should be an internal responsibility of the citizens of a country, of the various institutions within the country, which can hold governments accountable. In actual fact, Andy, just to go back to Dr. Ngo'S submission, he talks about mobilization, political mobilization. He talks about the recent Zambian elections and basically says that was the success of NGOs because there was a change of government. You can actually see the underlying thinking in his discussions.
So let me get this straight, Minister. Are you saying then that NGOs do not have any rights in terms of criticizing or pointing out any government's failings at all?
Never said that.
Okay.
They are part of the civic societal framework that can criticize the government. What we are against is a situation where they are used as a tool by foreigners, funded by foreigners, given ideological orientations by foreigners, in fact, even given ideologies of self-hate by foreigners, where everything that is African gets demeaned And you are almost taught to say everything about your country is negative. That's what we are against.
Professor, I know you had a comment there. I will come to you, but I wanted to bring Musa in here because, Musa, a further criticism leveled against NGOs is that they are or will be more accountable to their funders than those they serve, because they are largely dependent on external funding, particularly here in Zimbabwe. Their projects are crafted in line with donor preferences instead of projects targeted for those they supposedly represent. In other words, he who pays the piper calls and plays the tune. Your comment?
So, who exactly are these NGOs? When you speak of civil society organizations, where are these creatures from? Civil society organizations are the people, it's citizens. And it's the citizens who are responsible for putting these governments in power. They are the citizens who are responsible for holding these governments to account. In terms of our constitution, for instance, all power, government power, executive, legislative, judiciary, derives from the people. And it is in those spaces that are outside the state that we call civil society that people are able to hold government to account and to self-organize over particular collective interest. And what we have seen is accountability, peer accountability among each other, because these are citizens, these are organizations that are serving collective interest. But in terms of accountability to the state as well, they are provisions within the current PVO Act, for instance, around submission of reports, around submission of audited statements to the ministry and the PVO board, to the registrar of PVOs. And this has been done. This is the manner in which the accountability, if it is to do with, say, for instance, illicit movement of funding, it can be done. And we believe that has been done sufficiently in the past. Where there have been lapses, I believe the regulatory authority, the ministry, the registrar, has been able to take action.
There's a conundrum, the critics allege. The conundrum is, of course, when is the work of NGOs strictly following their mandate, or when is it possible for it to be perceived as political will? An NGO is following its mandate. They're building houses in a specific area. They're funded by a foreign organization who possibly the government may think is a regime change agent. There's another NGO that's funded by a friend of the government who's doing exactly the same work. The conundrum is, when is one a political action and when is one an NGO fulfilling its mandate?
It depends on who is the backer. And we are still talking about some NGOs so that we don't put everybody in one basket. We will do them an injustice if we did that.
Agreed.
There's some NGOs. If an NGO takes money from, say, USAID, and USAID takes its money from...
As an example, of course.
As an example, from the American government. The American government has made it clear that they want to remove Mugabe here. So if a Zimbabwean NGO takes money through the chain from the American government, the American government has declared itself an enemy of the Zimbabwe government. In the UK, where we lived, if a UK citizen goes and lie in bed with an enemy government, try to come and do things in the UK, you will be arrested and prosecuted. So that is where the line is drawn.
But what's the difference then between, say, a friend or enemy of, or perceived friend or enemy of a government? I mean, where is the line? Where's the conundrum? Because as I said, one is doing exactly the same work as the other. It's just that the backers are different. One's regarded as political, the other is regarded as helping the country.
Let me start you an example. Say, if an NGO is supported by China and so another supported by the USA, during the Liberation War, China, we know the role China played, and we know the role USA played. We know the role USA has played from 2000 up to now. If an NGO is supported by the USA, they may be doing legitimate work. But because of where the support is coming from, you are tainted by who is supporting you. You can't go and take money from the American government and come and say, I'm going to distribute tomatoes to people in Mutare.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to bring in Neil, but let me first ask the Minister exactly the same question. I think, Minister, you're getting the conundrum I'm trying to get an answer to, which I asked before. As I said, two NGOs, as we said, please, we're not labeling all NGOs, some NGOs, of course, as well, perceived NGOs. They're both doing exactly the same work, but they're backed by one perceived as an enemy of the government, one perceived as a friend of the government. When is it looked at as political and not?
In actual fact, Andy, there are many NGOs that have been funded from Western sources. We have done a good job in Zimbabwe. But there are others, evidence supplied, who have specifically an agenda to say this liberation movement, their time is up, they need to be removed. There are NGOs like that. Evidence supplied, money flowing.
Which the government is aware of,
Yes.
if I can put it that way, because
Yes.
according to Musa,
Yes.
he hasn't seen
Yes.
evidence supplied.
Yes.
You were saying there is evidence.
So there are things like that.
Okay.
There are, like I said, there are NGOs that have been externally supported, but benign activities, activities that complement what government is doing in the fields of education, health, and other places like that. And clearly operating within the mandates that they said they were going to operate. Remember, before an international NGO or even a local NGO that wants to work with a government department is allowed to do that, they have to sign an MOU with the government. We also have a policy on how they should operate, even at subnational level, the provincial level, the district level, and how they are supposed to be coordinated. We have that. We are now strengthening that. As we review the Act, we are also reviewing that policy. So indeed, there are some external sources of resources that are really benign. But there are others where the mandate given to those NGOs is to say, go and influence.
Okay, I do want to bring Dr. Neo in, but before I do, Minister, just briefly as well, I just need you to clear this up. Two NGOs carrying out exactly the same work. They have the mandate, they've submitted their MOUs, they've signed MOUs with the government, which have been approved. They're both following exactly the same work. The only difference is that they're backed by different people. Okay, one possibly perceived as an enemy of the state, or if I can call it against the government, another one as a friend of the government. How does the government determine if it's politically motivated or not? I think this is
that's what we are saying. We have not done that.
Okay.
As a government, we have not done that. We have allowed some NGOs funded by the West to operate because, like I say, we have adjudged their work to be work that is bona fide, assisting maybe relief work or...
And within the mandate that
yes, within the mandate. We have not had any problems with that.
Okay. Dr. Neo, I'd like to get your views on this subject because, of course, this is why I try to get to the bottom of this, what I would call a conundrum, or what critics call a conundrum. You know, when can the actions and projects carried out by an NGO be defined as political, or carrying out a regime change agenda, or in fact following the dictates of the NGO's funders, or is it actually irrelevant? Because as commentators said, and I think you said earlier, why should any government be worried about NGOs in your view when actually the people that matter are the ones that vote for them at elections, and therefore NGOs then effectively become, or should become, irrelevant, as some commentators say. Dr. Neo?
Yes, I think those who say that some NGOs pursue a regime change agenda, I think it's missing the point as what multi-party political systems are supposed to be about. Multi-party political systems presuppose competition for ideas, competition to rule. So when people are empowered with information of government performance, of government's omissions and so forth, you know, and so it's up to them to decide whether they want to retain that government or not. It's the whole issue of regime change does not come in this thing, because that's why there are other political parties. So people will decide whether to change that government or not. But to talk about regime change, I think it's the government in power should not be afraid of those who want them to be removed through a democratic means. You shouldn't be afraid of that, because that's the whole idea of multi-party system. But to say that these people are siding with the opposition, what's wrong with that? Because the opposition are there to compete for power. The competition are there to bring forward different ideas. So really, when there are two different type of NGOs, one which the state believes is there to campaign for maintenance of status quo, and the other NGOs that tell people that not everything is all right. So it's up to you to decide whether to retain this government or to replace it. I think what NGOs do is simply providing empowering information. That's all. That's what they do. To tell people to turn up to vote. That's mobilization I'm talking about. Mobilization is simply encouraging people to register to vote, encouraging people to turn up to vote. That's all. And to tell them that it's important that they actually vote. Those are the things that the NGOs do. But also to bring the issues, because there are issues. What are the issues that people should decide on? So governments should not be afraid of that. They should simply perform why they were elected to be there. And if they don't perform, they should not be surprised if the opposition win, or if the opposition gets support. So for me, I think that we should not talk about regime change unless it's in the context of unconstitutional change of office, unconstitutional change of power, where you use other means. But if it is through the elections, there's nothing wrong with that. And actually, the term regime change is a wrong term to be used in the context of multi-party democracy. There's nothing like that, regime change. The opposition is there to replace the incumbent. That's what's there. You cannot have opposition parties, but still be afraid of regime change.
All right, I have to jump in there. You're watching The Chase, Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program, brought to you, of course, live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Our discussion: are NGOs the invisible hand in African elections? This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network, ZTN. Now, we only have a few minutes left of our show, but I do want to ask you each a final question. And so please, I'll ask you to be brief. Minister, Tafazwa Muguti, he's the provincial development coordinator for Harare province. He had a letter directing all NGOs to submit their work plans for the 2021 to the office of the PDC. Of course, Minister, critics and commentators allege that Zimbabwe's government is trying to ensure that all NGOs do their bidding and work on government sanctions programs and projects only, and that the government wants to use NGOs in their work to in turn push the ruling party's agenda in the eyes of citizens, especially rural citizens, as Zimbabwe approaches the 2023 elections. Your comment?
Tafazwa Mguti was actually acting on the basis of his interpretation of the policy that I referred to earlier on. That policy, that's what it says. For any organization that is supposed to be operational at the provincial level, they are supposed to do exactly what Tafazwa said about those NGOs operating within Harare. Just to, as a government, we need to know who is doing what.
So it's not so that government can jump on the good work that some NGOs are doing and say, we're doing this so citizens believe.
Let me tell you, Andy, 99.9% of the delivery of services in any country, especially a country like ours, is provided for by the government. I'll give you an example. Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education, $2 billion, United States dollars, goes into the activities of that ministry every year. Above $1 billion comes from government. Close to $1 billion comes from the parents who pay fees and other provisions. Only about $50 to $60 million comes from NGOs and development partners.
So why be concerned then? Is there a why is
no,
there a concern?
This is what I'm saying. We make a whole lot of noise of the contributions of NGOs and development partners without realizing, as our president has said, nyika inovakwa never nevayo. What we are against is an organization that gives its a name suggesting that things are not right in Zimbabwe, then going out to get resources to push an agenda to say a specific political movement should be removed because that political movement is asserting the independence and sovereignty of this country.
I do want to bring my other guest in, Minister, but I need to push you on this subject. You used a good example in the education sector, 99.9% is delivered by government, only 0.1% is delivered by NGOs. Then why make an amendment? I mean, if it doesn't really matter, it won't matter in terms of political playing field or whether the electorate votes for the ruling party or not. Why put in place
there is
regulation?
Nothing like self-regulation in a modern state. Modern states are built specifically to provide regulation. Otherwise, you will become a victim of crime. You know, it becomes a war of all against all.
So you're saying it's just
there has to be regulation.
It's not about threat, scaredness, or anything like that. It's just regulatory.
No, but in the political space, we cannot allow a situation where individual NGOs are supported specifically to go and campaign
Thank you.
for or against.
We do have only about 4 minutes left, so I am going to have to ask my other guests to be brief, but I do want to ask you, Musa, what is the way forward? I mean, how can NGOs, who I think everyone admits some of them do excellent work in Zimbabwe and around Africa, I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think if we look at Cyclone Idai, the humanitarian monies that poured in there, working with government, the rebuilding of Chimanimani, which of course in Zimbabwe's eastern highlands, I mean, we cannot fault some of the work, and that's an example of just some of the good work NGOs do. How do you believe NGOs can work hand in hand with African governments in a non-partisan way, as the government believes, but with the ability to be objective? Do you believe that actually this is already the case in Zimbabwe in particular?
Objectivity ought to be our driver. And that is what has been happening with most NGOs. The minister gave an example with education. I would term that to be selective evidence, for instance. Look at legal aid. The point is, the market for NGOs is created by the gaps created by the government's errors of omissions and commission. Legal aid, for instance, in Zimbabwe, we have the Legal Aid Directorate, but I would say over 80% of the legal aid in Zimbabwe is provided by non-governmental organizations, and I think that's a fact. So when we look at evidence selectively, we then underplay or downplay the role that NGOs can play. The point being, to go back to where the minister started, complementing each other is what is needed. And where NGOs come in and point at errors of commission and omission, those points ought to be accepted as constructive criticism. It's a duty, it's a responsibility of citizens, it's a constitutional duty. And the government is duty bound to respond positively to such, as opposed to then terming that political activity.
Thank you, Mr. Bafo. Again, you have to be brief. What, in your view, is the way forward? How can NGOs, or some NGOs, if I can say that, because it is a fact, as I said, that there are lots of NGOs out there who are doing sterling work for our country, not just Zimbabwe, but also in Africa. How can NGOs and African governments work in a collaborative way for the common good? Yeah,
I think I like the way Musa talks about the good NGOs. Musa, you are talking about the good NGOs. But there are bad NGOs, and we know them. And Dr. Neo is trying to paint a picture of a world where there are no bad NGOs. The bad NGOs is what your question here, the invisible hand we're talking about. I think we need regulation. If I go into the market now and buy a Mercedes-Benz, it will come with a manual. It will tell me what I can do with the car and what I cannot do with the car. Yes. So any country, if we who live in the West, we know NGOs cannot or are not allowed to self-regulate. There are state laws that the NGOs must comply with. So over here in Africa, we leave things for granted. Like us in the media, we cry foul when any government try to come with laws to regulate the media. Everywhere in the West, the media are regulated. We can't have regulate less wealth in Africa. So they have to regulate.
I have to jump in there. Dr. Neo, I can only give you a few seconds. You know, I think just very briefly the same question. NGOs working collaboratively with government, you know, how can that be achieved? And as I said, I can only give you a very brief moment.
Granted, there are bad NGOs. I don't dispute that. But I think the overreaction of governments over NGOs that do good civic education, water education, that raise issues of accountability and so forth, is unwarranted. I think governments should find that to be useful, that they are being held to account, that NGOs give citizens a voice. That's one way that NGOs do, but that's what they speak on behalf of citizens. But since NGOs are voluntary organizations, so I think governments should take NGOs to be complementary. They're important. They raise issues that are important. Now, these things of the fact that they are there to discredit them or legitimize them and campaign for regime change, I think it's not really very helpful.
All right.
What government should do is simply perform to the satisfaction of citizens.
All right, Dr. Neil, I have to jump in there. Minister, we have to finalize and finish, and I'm going to give you a very brief time. What is the government of Zimbabwe's message to NGOs who wish to work in the country?
Get registered, state your mandate, keep within your mandate, familiarize yourselves with the requirements for compliance, and live by those, and we'll be happy to work with those NGOs.
I think on that note, we have come to the end of the chase this evening. This is Zimbabwe's premier current affairs program. You have been watching our discussion, Are NGOs the Invisible Hand in African Elections? I'd like to thank my guests, Professor Paul Mavima, Zimbabwe's Minister of Public Service, Labour and Social Welfare, Bafo Nkoma, former editor of the London-based New African magazine and editor of the African Factbook, Dr. Musa Kika, Executive Director, Zimbabwe Human Rights NGO Forum, and Dr. Neo Sumutanyi, Executive Director, Center for Policy Dialogue based in Lusaka, Zambia. Thank you all once again for appearing on The Chase this evening.
Thank you, Andy.
This broadcast was brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network, ZTN. Well, that's it from me this evening. I'm Andy Hodges. Have a great evening, good night, and please, you all be safe. Goodbye.